If you want to keep your online account safe, you need a password manager. If you've been looking for an affordable password manager, you've probably come across Bitwarden. If you looked even harder, then you might also find one called VaultWarden, which looks very similar to Bitwarden, but is quite different under the covers. In this video, I'm going to review and compare them, so you can decide which is best for you. Welcome back to the Pro Tech Show. Passwords are a menace. The very concept of passwords is a bad idea for online security. Most security breaches occur because of passwords, and the best thing you can do is to stop using them. Unfortunately, not all websites will let you ditch passwords yet, so we're stuck with them for the time being. That means you need to make them as secure as possible. Long, complex, ideally randomly generated, long as in really long, the longer the better, and unique. That's right, I have literally hundreds of accounts, and every single one of them has to have a completely unique password. Even if you're a genius, this is an impossible task to remember. So what we actually need to do is use a password manager. A password manager is an application that generates these crazy complicated passwords for us, and we use the password manager to log us into our accounts. A password manager therefore needs to be two things. It needs to be secure, and it needs to be affordable or even free. There's nothing wrong with paying good money for a good password manager, but this is a necessity, not a luxury, so we absolutely need reasonable options that are available to everyone regardless of budget. That's where Bitwarden comes in. Bitwarden is what I would describe as cheap and cheerful. It's not the most comprehensive password manager out there, but it covers all of the standard things you need at a really good price, or even free. Most password managers do have free tiers, but what sets Bitwarden apart is that its free tier is actually usable. It isn't crippled like most of its competitors. There is no limit on the number of passwords you can store or the number of devices you can use. There are plugins for the major browsers, mobile apps, desktop apps, and a web app. It does the sort of things you'd expect from a password manager. You can save credentials automatically, you can autofill login forms. It is a random password generator to create those long complex passwords for you. It can even store one-time passcodes for sites with multi-factor authentication. I know this freaks some people out and they think Bitwarden just made their multi-factor single-factor. The short answer is no, it didn't, as long as you set it up right. There are scenarios where this is an incredibly useful feature, and there are times when you might want to avoid it. If you want the pros and cons of this in more detail, then leave me a comment, I'll make a dedicated video on it and we can all go argue about it there. If you move up to the paid version for additional features, it's still incredibly cheap. It's less than $1 a month if you pay annually, less again if you get the family plan and split it between multiple people. At this price, I can overlook a few usability niggles, but what about security? It's pretty well thought through. Bitwarden uses a zero-knowledge model, meaning Bitwarden has no access to your data. Everything is encrypted on your local device before being transferred to the server. Even if you use the web app, the encryption happens in your browser. The server is really just a mechanism for storing and syncing your encrypted data. It can't read it. Even if the Bitwarden server was compromised and the data stolen, there's no way to decrypt it without your password, and the server doesn't have the password. There are a few downsides to this approach. For individual users, the main one is that if you forget your master password, you're pretty screwed, because Bitwarden doesn't know what it is, and your data can't be decrypted without it. One of the paid features is the ability to delegate emergency access to your vault to someone else, which you can use as a mechanism to recover your account if you forget your master password, as long as you don't both forget, of course. Another notable feature of Bitwarden is that it's open source. This means the code is publicly available. There is an argument that open source software is inherently more secure because nothing is hidden. Everyone can see it, so if there's a vulnerability in the code, it will be found and fixed. I do appreciate the transparency of open source, and having access to the code is the ultimate resource for troubleshooting. But I think this security argument is flawed. We've seen numerous times in recent years that just because everyone can review the code doesn't mean anyone actually will. Heartbleed was a big wake-up call for those relying on open source because it was a clangor of a coding mistake, and when it came to light, everyone realised that everyone had assumed someone else would review the code, with the result being that nobody actually did. Worse still, they found the bug had been exploited for months before it was discovered, meaning the only people who'd been reviewing the code were the bad guys. Fortunately, Bitwarden is not sitting back and hoping the good guys are reviewing the code. It's there so they can, but Bitwarden has also taken the active step of paying for independent audits of their software, systems and processes, and publishing the results warts and all. This is a really great thing to see. It demonstrates trustworthiness and transparency and gives me confidence in their service. As far as it goes for an individual consumer or family, Bitwarden gets my thumbs up. I won't say it's the best password manager in terms of raw capabilities, but it is probably the best value, and it includes everything you actually need. Even the free version is perfectly usable for an individual without annoying restrictions. When it comes to business use, it's a bit more difficult for me to give it a blanket recommendation. I know there are plenty of businesses that use it, but the scenarios here can vary quite a lot. When you look at password managers, there's a scale that starts with an individual user on one end, then you have a family use case with a bit of shared access, then a simple business use case with more sharing, and increasing needs for auditing, integration, and automation, right up to a complex enterprise use case. Bitwarden to me is great at the individual and family levels. For businesses, if you just want to give your staff a password manager to store their own business credentials, then it's basically the same scenario as an individual, but lots of them, so this is fine. If you want to share passwords within a small team, then it's a bit like a family scenario. But as your needs get more complex, Bitwarden doesn't cut it for me. I work for a managed services provider, and we have a lot of people who need regular access to very sensitive passwords that grant highly privileged access to other organisations. When one of my team leaves, I don't want to be messing about trying to figure out what they may have had access to. I want to hit a button and have the password manager automatically report on every password they viewed since its last change. In fact, I want the password manager to connect to as many of those systems as possible, revoke that person's access, change the password, update systems that may have been reliant on that password, and document the new one automatically. Then only tell me about the ones that require manual intervention. There are passwords that we may want people to have access to, but only in certain specific circumstances. So there may be a workflow where they can request temporary access, subject to approval by their manager, or maybe even by the customer they're working with. We might want to give someone access to log into a system without actually seeing the password, by having the password manager inject it transparently in a way that is never exposed to the client. These are the enterprise features I look for. Bitwarden does not have these kind of enterprise features. And to be honest, it probably shouldn't. This is a different class of password manager I'm talking about. And just as Bitwarden doesn't scale up to this more complex business scenario, these enterprise password managers don't scale down to individual users very well. The last one I looked at has a free tier, but it also comes with a recommendation for £23,000 worth of professional services to help your IT team set it up. And this was hosted software as a service. Imagine trying to give that to your average consumer. Bitwarden doesn't have these enterprise capabilities, but if they tried to, I think they'd ruin the simplicity of what they have now, and there's no way they could afford to deliver it at the same low price. That said, they have been adding legitimately useful business features to their enterprise plan. For my tastes, it's still a bit weak on reporting and management for business use. As a business administrator, I'd want to be able to control client application settings in order to meet policy, and Bitwarden's apps are only partially controllable, with some security settings left to the end user to decide, like automatically clearing the clipboard. By default, that's disabled, but I would like to enforce a policy to have Bitwarden not keep sensitive credentials in the clipboard any longer than is necessary. Asking end users to pretty please make manual changes to their default security settings isn't what I'd expect from a business-focused product. I'd like to have custom templates and the ability to specify rules for their use, like a minimum length for administrative credentials. Also, whilst it does record events that could be used to figure out what password someone has accessed, it would be good to see built-in reporting so you can find the information quickly rather than having to parse through different event logs yourself to figure it out. Pricing from the business side isn't as impressive as the personal plans. It's in the sort of ballpark now where it's competing against tools with somewhat more mature business feature sets, so it's not the slam dunk in terms of value that the personal plans are, but the business plans are still priced fairly. To me, Bitwarden is a good consumer password manager, and they are building on this with business-focused features, but it wouldn't be my first choice there. One of the more interesting things about Bitwarden is that regardless of whether you're using the free, personal or business versions, you have the option to self-host it. If you're not able or don't want to store data in the cloud, or you want to keep the entire thing offline, then this is an option. If you're considering self-hosting though, this is the point you might start to consider Vaultwarden instead. Vault Warden at first glance looks like a fork of Bitwarden, but it is in fact a re-implementation of Bitwarden using the Rust programming language. It used to be called Bitwarden RS, but they changed the name at Bitwarden's request to avoid confusion with the official Bitwarden project. Vault Warden is free, there are no paid plans, and there is no support other than from the community. In terms of features, it's not a direct match for any of Bitwarden's plans. Not all of Bitwarden's features have been implemented in Vault Warden, but it's close to something between the family and teams plans. In terms of user experience, it's pretty much identical. In fact, Vault Warden doesn't even have its own apps, you just use the official Bitwarden ones. Vault Warden is implementing the same protocols as Bitwarden, so as far as the official apps and browser plugins are concerned, they think they're talking to an official Bitwarden server. This raises the question, if the experience is the same, and Bitwarden already has a pretty comprehensive free plan, why bother to create Vault Warden in the first place? Bitwarden has options for self-hosting, but it doesn't give you a lot of control. It's distributed in containerized form, and that's your only official option. If you don't want to use containers, tough. If you want a different reverse proxy than Nginx, tough. This is what you get, it's one size fits all. When you consider that Bitwarden provides a service, complete with software updates, hosting, and full support, for less than $1 a month, this makes sense. If you need to contact them for support even once in a year, then by the time they've read your email, they're already making a loss. So it needs to be as standardized as possible. If they let customers muck about with it, they'll end up supporting that mucking about, and they'll have to increase the price for everyone. So this is a fair trade-off. But for those who want to muck about or customize, then there's Vault Warden. Another reason for choosing Vault Warden is that it's designed to run with much less overhead than Bitwarden. Bitwarden runs on a Microsoft technology stack of .NET and SQL Server. If you're running a personal instance on limited hardware, Bitwarden spins up a bunch of containers that consume, well, not a ridiculous amount of memory. The minimum specification says it requires 2 GB, which is hardly extravagant for a server. But I loaded my data into Vault Warden and measured it using about 60 MB. That's tiny, and means Vault Warden can run on pretty much anything. This doesn't mean Bitwarden is inefficient, they're just set up differently by default. Vault Warden doesn't spin up a reverse proxy for you. You can add your own, assuming you want one, which you probably do. Vault Warden also defaults to a SQLite database rather than the Microsoft SQL Server, although it can use MySQL or MariaDB or PostgreSQL if you prefer. SQLite is fine for a few users, but you should expect to hit scalability problems if you try to run a full business off it, because only one person can write to the database at any time. The Microsoft SQL Server is much more scalable, but if you're just running a personal or family instance, then you don't need that scalability and you might prefer the leaner default Vault Warden implementation. You're also not limited to containerization with Vault Warden. That's the most common way to run it, but you can grab statically linked binaries as well and run it as a systemd service, or compile your own. Although I understand why they don't, I do wish Bitwarden offered a binary package, because they're using Microsoft technologies in a Linux container, so if you install the Bitwarden server on a Windows host, you're actually running Microsoft software in Linux, in a container, in a virtual machine, in Windows. It's technically fine, but something about that just seems a bit crazy instead of putting Microsoft software directly on Windows if that's your chosen platform. If Vault Warden is starting to sound interesting, you might be wondering about its security. How does that compare to Bitwarden and their third-party code audits and reviews? Well, Vault Warden doesn't have that, but it doesn't matter as much as you might think. Vault Warden is self-hosted, so there is no hosting platform to audit. The Vault Warden server code is open source like Bitwarden, although it hasn't been through the same paid-for third-party audits like Bitwarden. However, if you remember, your passwords are all encrypted on the client before anything gets transmitted to the server. The server is really just a cloud storage and sync tool for encrypted data that is gibberish without the decryption key that the server never actually sees. The place where your data is actually exposed is in the client apps, and with Vault Warden you use the official Bitwarden apps. So although Vault Warden itself hasn't been audited like Bitwarden, it is the audited Bitwarden apps that are used to access your passwords regardless of whether you're using Bitwarden or Vault Warden on the server. One possible exception to this rule is the web app. Vault Warden just copies the Bitwarden app, but it is their own distribution of it. So if there was malicious code in Vault Warden, this is the one place it could theoretically do some damage. If you're really paranoid, just don't use the web vault and stick with the official Bitwarden apps. This leads us to the big question of this video. If you like the idea of the wardens, which should you choose? Bitwarden or Vault Warden? First up, if you aren't planning to host the server yourself, the answer is Bitwarden. Vault Warden is only available as a self-hosted option, and although you might find someone offering Vault Warden as a hosted service, I very much doubt you'll find someone with SOC 2 and 3 certifications offering it with support for less than $1 a month. If you do, tell me in the comments. If you're planning to use this in a scenario where a business is reliant on it, choose Bitwarden. Vault Warden has a community you can pose questions to, but if something goes wrong and your business is impacted, you want to be able to talk to the people who built it, and you want to talk to them now. Bitwarden is the way to go for that. And remember, it's their client apps you're using either way. So if Vault Warden breaks, you could end up bouncing between the Vault Warden community and Bitwarden to get the answer anyway. You're also less likely to have compatibility issues with Bitwarden because they're building both sides of the equation and testing against their server. There is a risk they change something and the apps stop working correctly for Vault Warden users until Vault Warden releases an update for the server as they're playing catch up. Really, the only scenario where Vault Warden makes more sense is if you're self-hosting it, and it's not so mission critical that you can't afford to have downtime. And actually, both Bitwarden and Vault Warden are a good fit for self-hosting in a home lab sort of capacity. The thing about password managers is that if they're unavailable, you're kind of stuck because you can't log into anything. You need to think this through because you don't want your server to crash and suddenly you realize you need the password manager to get the password to log into your server to fix the password manager. That would be dumb, but I've seen companies end up in this sort of position before. What makes the Wardens good for this scenario is that you don't actually need the server to access your passwords. Any device that has already synced a copy of your vault can keep on accessing it without talking to the server. The only time it talks to the server is to make changes, so if the server dies, your devices all have a read-only copy of your vault that you can continue to use until the server is fixed. Worst case scenario, you can build a new server from scratch, export the passwords from your existing vault where you've synced it already, then import that into your new server and start again with all your data intact. Should you choose Bitwarden or Vault Warden in this scenario? If you're willing to pay and have sufficient resource to run it, Bitwarden is the more robust answer. If you can't afford or don't want to pay for Bitwarden, you can use Vault Warden for free. It's worth noting here that the free version of Bitwarden cannot share passwords between accounts when self-hosted, so if you're going for the free self-hosted option, Vault Warden is functionally superior. Vault Warden is also a better choice if your hardware options are very limited, or if you want to run it on a free tier cloud server, because Bitwarden will struggle to fit on those. Finally, Vault Warden is a better choice if you want to tinker with it. It's more customizable and you have a wide range of deployment options. In short, I'd say Bitwarden is for serious, boring, sensible use, and Vault Warden is for techies for whom it's not just a tool, but also a hobby and they want full control over everything. I'll put links to both of them in the video description, along with the official list of features that are missing from Vault Warden compared to Bitwarden. If you found this video useful, then give it a like, and if you want to elevate your security even further, then remember what I said at the start. The best thing you can do is not to use passwords at all. I'll explain how you can do that in this video here, so go watch that, set up passwordless logins everywhere you possibly can, then use a password manager for the rest.